This is the "and more" from the series title. In addition to the original 1066 and all that, we are also taking on another comic history of England called, appropriately, Bill Nye's Comic History of England. No, it's a different Bill Nye. Actually, Edgar Wilson Nye, a late 19th century American humorist. His book was written in 1896, 34 years before 1066. The main difference between the books, besides their nationalities, is that Nye maintains some integrity. The names, dates, and places are factual. They may be embellished a bit from time to time, and side issues are fair game for a bit of exaggeration. For example, unicorns and Charles Dickens. Or in Nye's own words, quote, "Wherein will be found a recital of the many eventful events which transpired in England from the Druids to Henry VIII. The author does not feel it incumbent upon him to preserve more than the dates and facts, and these are correct, but the lights and shades, the various pictures, and the ornamental words furnished to adorn the characters and events are the sole invention of this historian." Unquote. Sadly, Nye died while writing this, so it only goes up to the Henry VIII marriage go-round. One other difference is that my brother Clarence won't be here. He says he needs to recover after each of the 1066 episodes, so our cousin Phineas will be taking over the commentary duties for these. The two will alternate, keeping the events covered as parallel as we can. Parts of this book may need to be extracted from rather than presented in whole, or paraphrased to some extent to accomplish this. But it should be interesting. Chapter 1. Invasion of Caesar, the discovery of tin, and consequent enlightenment of Britain. From the glad whinny of the first unicorn down to the tip end of the 19th century, the history of Great Britain has been dear to her descendants in every land, 'neath every sky. But to write a truthful and honest history of any country, the historian should, that he may avoid overpraise and silly and mawkish sentiment, reside in a foreign country. The writer of these pages, though of British descent, will, in what he may say, guard carefully against permitting that fact to swerve him one swift moment from the right. England, even before Christ, as now, was sort of a money center, and thither came the Phoenicians and the Carthaginians for their tin.
The Phoenicians and their successors, the Carthaginians, had been obtaining tin from Cornwall since around 445 BCE, long before any of the events in either of these books. After the Punic Wars, victorious Rome took over the trade routes and eventually decided they would take the source for themselves.
These early Britons were suitable only to act as ancestors. Aside from that, they had no good points. They dwelt in mud huts thatched with straw. Their boats were made of wicker work plastered with clay. Their swords were made of tin, alloyed with copper, and after a brief skirmish, the entire army had to fall back and straighten their blades. They also had a short spear made with a rawhide string attached, so that the deadly weapon could be jerked back again. To spear an enemy with one of those harpoons, and then, after playing him for a half an hour or so, to land him and finish him up with the tin sword,
not unlike modern deep-sea fishing,
constituted one of the most reliable boons peculiar to that strange people. Caesar first came to Great Britain on account of a bilious attack. On the way across the Channel, a violent storm came up. The great emperor and Pantata believed he was drowning, so that in an instant's time, everything throughout his whole lifetime recurred to him as he went down, especially his breakfast.
There's a lot to unpick in one little paragraph. First, it's already been established that Caesar was not an emperor. Bilious has to do with a queasy stomach and vomiting. In less poetic terms, he was seasick. Though I doubt if there's actually any evidence to support it. Pantata is a problem. It appears to be a Finnish word. 5 of the 6 definitions I found says it's a verb meaning something like pawning or pledging as security, that sort of thing, which makes no sense at all. The 6th says it was a slang term from the back streets of New York meaning gang boss or such, much like the Italian capo, which makes perfect sense in this context. Since they were following no actual chronology, Seller and Yateman threw in a totally ridiculous reference to Boudica at this point, just so they could make a terrible pun. Then they proceeded to ignore her, even though she was an important figure in the early days of Roman Britain. We'll have more in a bit when the calendar catches up with us. And they made only one brief mention of Druids, which was mainly wrong.
Caesar later on made more invasions, one of them for the purpose of flogging a Druid with whom he had disagreed religiously on a former trip. The Druids were the sheriffs, priests, judges, chiefs of police, plumbers, and justices of the peace. They practically ran the place, and no one could be a Druid who could not pass a civil service examination. They believed in human sacrifice, and often of a bright spring morning could have been seen going out behind the bush to sacrifice someone who disagreed with him on some religious point or another. The Druids lived largely in the woods in summer and in debt during the winter. They worshipped almost everything that had been left out overnight. Caesar was a broad man from the religious point of view,
Whatever that means.
and favored bringing the Druids before the grand jury.
Grand juries didn't exist until the 12th century.
For uttering such sentiments as these, the Druids declared his life to be forfeit, and set one of their number to settle also with him, after morning services, the question as to the matter of immersion and sound money. Religious questions were even then as hotly discussed as in later times, and Caesar could not enjoy society very much for 5 or 6 days. At Stonehenge there are still relics of a stone temple which the Druids used as a place of idolatrous worship and assassination. On Giblet Day, people came for many miles to see the exercises and carry home a few cutlets of intimate friends.
That's a good story, but sadly, there's no reliable evidence of Caesar interacting with the British Druids, just those back in Gaul. The main source of information about the Druids in Britannia comes from Tacitus, who had an agenda. All the myths and legends we have about the Druids come from distortions of this little bit of dubious data and a lot of wishful thinking among some 18th century Romanticist poets.
After this, Rome sent over various great federal appointees to soften and refine the people. Among them came General Agricola, and a new kind of seed corn and kindness in his heart. He taught the barefoot Briton to go out to the pump every evening and bathe his chapped and soiled-kissed feet and wipe them on the grass before retiring, thus introducing one of the refinements of Rome in this cold and barbaric clime. In around 60 CE, Queen Boudica got so disgusted with the Romans, who carried on there in England just as they had been in the habit of doing at home, cutting up like a Halloween party in its junior year, that she got her Britons together, had a steel dress made to fight in comfortably and not tight under the arms. Then she said, "Is there anyone here who hath a culverin with him?"
There's a lot that needs to be said about Boudica. First, modern pronunciation of her name is Boadicea, and that may not even have been her name. Boudica translates from Brythonic, the language spoken by Eastern Britons, as victorious woman. It could have been just an epithet, and we will never know her real name. The culverin, basically a small handheld cannon, didn't appear until the 15th century.
One was soon found and fired.
No, it wasn't. I just told you they didn't exist.
Whatever it was regarded by the Romans as an opening of hostilities. Her fire was returned with great eagerness, and victory was won in the city of London over the Romans, who had taunted the Queen several times with being 7 years behind the beginning of the Christian era in the matter of clothes. Boudica won victories by the score, and it is said that under the besom of her wrath, 70,000 Roman warriors kissed the dust. Disgusted with war and the cooking they were having at the time, she burst into tears just on the eve of a general victory over the Romans and poisoned herself.
After a string of victories, the uprising was finally quelled, but no one knows where. Neither of the major historians of the time make any mention of a location. Geographic and logistical hints seem to suggest maybe somewhere along Watling Street, northwest of London, but there's no consensus. Besom is a somewhat archaic term for broom, especially one with a connotation of a witch's transport. Cooking was not involved. The Britons finally got trounced in a big way. One historian said she fell sick and died, and the other said she poisoned herself. Those are not mutually exclusive. Taking poison would make you sick and die.
I notice an error in the artist's work, which will be apparent to anyone of moderate intelligence, and especially to the Englishman, viz., the tin discovered by the Phoenicians is in the form of cans, etc., formerly having contained tinned meats, fruits, etc. This book, I fear, will be sharply criticized in England if any inaccuracy be permitted to creep in, even through the illustrations. You've probably noticed some differences in language over the past 130 years. Some word usage, some grammar, other features, which made reciting the narration somewhat challenging in places. But, okay, we made it. Next, back to 1066, then back here, and so on. Time to check on the cats. Man, they're getting rambunctious. Better click on something to calm them down.